Hello, horse traders and hall monitors. My name is TV Skyen, and the Season 2024 League of Legends cinematic, Still Here, has launched, and I watched it, and I was like, oh, that's pretty cool, and then I sort of pushed it away a little bit and sort of forgot about it for a bit, because I've got a bunch of other stuff going on. And then people sort of started asking, hey, that cinematic, do you think it's cool? Do you want to make a video about it? And it's like, yeah, I don't know. So I watched it a couple of times again just to sort of gather my thoughts about it, and then it turned out, oh boy, I have a lot of thoughts about it, actually, and then it tried to sort of write a script about it, and then that script turned into, well, a lot of criticism, like a lot of negatives, and that was not quite right on its own, because I do have a lot of criticisms that I want to voice about exactly how this thing is put together and like the stuff that's in it. But there's also a lot of really good stuff, right? Like there's also a bunch of cool stuff, and I was working on trying to figure out how to make a script out of that for like a more scripted video, and I have concluded at this point, after days of trying, that that's just not going to work. So we're going to do this the classic way. You, me, animated short, mostly unscripted. I'm just going to ramble. I'm going to lightly edit it so that it's put well together. And we're just going to enjoy ourselves. We're going to have fun. We're going to gush about all the cool shit that happens in this cinematic. We're going to have a good time. Then, in the second half of the, probably not half of the video, but like second part of the video, there's going to be a timestamp down below, I will drop into a more scripted format, and then we'll talk about my general criticisms of this animated short and some other structural things that sort of hang around the edges of that. Does that sound good to you all? Well, then yes, let's do that. Let's talk about the animation of Still Here. So, we open with a bookend, right? Like, that's essentially how Tryndamere and Ashe's and Kindred's part of the story is being used, is that they are the bookend, sort of the thesis statement and the closing statement of the thing. So, like, Tryndamere is on the ground, he's been beaten up very badly, is about to die, probably, and then out of the corner of his eyes, he sees this figure coming towards him in the distance. Who could it be? It seems to be carrying, maybe there's, like, the shadow of a bow or something right there. It has, like, slightly feminine form, but who can say? Who could it possibly be? We don't know. And then we cut to the other two stories that we need to interpret in light of what is happening with Tryndamere. And just to address it up front, Tryndamere has just killed all these guys in combat, and he's on the ground because he's been severely injured and beaten to within an inch of his life, which is so he's using his undying rage is going to kick in and keep him going even though he's on the brink of death. And yes, there are no wounds. We'll get into that when we get to the criticism section, but both here and with the Yasuo part of the cinematic, we're just gonna ignore that we have this very, very realistic style, and yet nobody seems to be able to take so much as a bruise. Talk about it later. For now, we're just going to focus on what the storytelling tells us. And I like this opening shot a lot in terms of how it uses, the lighting and the shadows of the thing. You have this battlefield where the shadows are encroaching from all sides, right? There's still some sunlight. There's a little bit of light left in the middle of it. And Tryndamere is there in the snow, but you can see that the light is, fading, right? The shadows are closing in. You have the long shadows of the Winter's Claw warriors, the shadow of the forest, and darkness is closing in around us. That, again, this is the thesis statement, and we're going to get a payoff for that at the end of the story, and that's kind of the point of this. And in fact, if I was smart, yes, I was smart, I would have grabbed both sections of Tryndamere's story so we can start with those independent of what happens in the rest of the thing. Because the second half of Tryndamere's story opens with this shot, and I think this is very clever because it is trees seen from the ground looking up into the sky, right? Like trees with no leaves on their branches. That's the literal thing that we're seeing right now. But what it also looks like is blood veins, right? It looks like arteries. It looks like that little red effect you get around the side of the screen in the game, like Call of Duty, when you're low on health and you need to get into, need to sit behind a wall for a while to recover from the lethal bullet wounds. That's what this looks like to me. I think it takes a little bit of the visual language of you are low on health that you get in video games, and again plays into this thing of we have brightness and then the darkness is closing in, right? It's reaching in from all sides. The tendrils of death are coming for Tryndamere, essentially, which I think is that's decent use of imagery. That's quite clever. And one thing to note is the color shift that happens, right? Because here we are this is the golden hour is 4 p.m. on maybe 3 p.m. on a winter's day. when the sun is low to the horizon, it's filtering through a lot of the atmosphere. You get this golden light bathing all over everything, right? And that's like that's gorgeous. But what happens the moment we shift into the next scene? The light has changed a lot. Now, rather than being golden, everything is blue. Everything's very cold, rather than being warm the way that it was. And that's sort of the first subtle hint we get that, oh, okay, something here has changed, right? Like, for one thing, where the hell are the Winter's Claw, right? Like, where's all the dudes that were there with him? Something has clearly shifted here. Something has changed, and the effect of the light dappled on the snow here all of a sudden is almost like he's underwater, right? It's like a little bit like it's light filtering down through some sort of ocean above. And you can see that, like, that color shift where everything's much more muted, everything's much less saturated. That sort of tells us that we are in a different kind of space, right? And I especially like the effect that all the snowflakes are hanging still in the air rather than falling, which has the dual effect. Like, in this dark space, that also kind of looks a little bit like stars in a night sky, doesn't it? And then we get the reveal of Lamb stepping out of the shadows. Right, and the breath here is used specifically, like, as, like, it coincides with, like, the music, in order to sort of keep the beat of the song, so you get this moment of quiet, and then this breath, and then, boom, wolf. And again, they're doing a real good job, we'll talk about this when we talk about Yasuo especially, of having the characters, like having death not be this thing that is, like, obvious, but this thing that's skulking around the edges of everything that's happening. This thing that's, like, hovering over everything that's happening. And then Tryndamere is the first one to, like, explicitly confront it. And quite violently, because he's one of the few characters in Runeterra who might quite genuinely be impossible to kill. Like, Tryndamere has not had a lore update in a very, very long time. The last thing he appeared in was, like, short story a couple of years ago, where he, like, that sort of shows how he interacts socially with the Avarosa, which is not great. Like, he's not very sociable man, as it turns out. But he's not had a lore update in ages. It used to be, a long time ago, that the reason Tryndamere can't die is because Aatrox found him and did some darken magic to him, and now every time he's close to death, the darken magic kicks in and, like, makes sure that he regenerates too fast to die, or something along those lines. That used to be the story. That has been, ever since the Darken sort of got rewritten. They used to be aliens, briefly, once upon a time. Then there were aliens, then they were demons, sort of, kind of, vaguely. And then eventually they got rewritten to be Shuriman, ascended, that have been corrupted over thousands of years. And those stories sort of made it a little bit like, why the fuck would Aatrox go to the Freljord? What does he want up there? He's not really a demon of war anymore. So that's kind of been quietly written out of his story, and now there's not really any explanation for why Tryndamere is the way that he is. He just rages real hard and then he can't die. So why Tryndamere is unable to be killed, why he has such a resistance to death, as we see here, and that's the literalization of the action that's happening here. As Tryndamere is fighting the Kindred, it's because he is refusing to give in to death. He's refusing to pass to the other side, right? That's the literal action that's happening here. And I'm actually going to skip past the fight a little bit to the thing that happens next that sort of ties into the stuff we've been talking about. As Kindred is about to, like, loose the final arrow, lowers the bow, here comes Ashe's arrows, and one of the better little visual tricks, as Ashe's arrows push in, they bring the golden light with them. They bring the warmth of life with them, right? Like, we are in this space that's visually very, very cold. Here comes Ashe pushing back the cold of death, and bringing Tryndamere back to life, quite literally bringing him back to life. Because the other interesting juxtaposition that's happening here is that Tryndamere's rage state, like, this whole time while he's been smacking around Wolf and dodging Kindred's arrows and shit like that, the storytelling here is that Tryndamere the whole time was actually fighting the Winter's Claw warriors. Like, that after he collapsed and sort of nearly passed out, that's when his battle rage kicked in, and this whole time he's just been beating the shit out of Winter's Claw warriors. But what he sees is that he's literally battling death. And that's what, like, the red eyes signify here, is that there's literally something wrong with his sight. He literally can't see things correctly. His battle rage blinds him to real life. It blinds him to what's actually happening, and instead he sees this vision of death that he's constantly struggling against, but it also separates him from reality, right? So the other thing that Ashe's arrows do is that they bring him back to the real world. They take him away from like this constant hallucination of death, this battle rage, and bring him back to life. Which, yes, absolutely, this should have been scored with Nightwish, as signified by when he sees her. The red fades, and he turns back to blue. And the other thing, of course, is also just that Ashe is one of the only people on Runeterra who can actually calm him the fuck down, because he loves her. Like, because they do have a very close emotional relationship. Again, well, actually, again, that seems to be Riot's point. The position on Ashe and Tryndamere right now is that they have a very close, they actually have a strong emotional connection. They love each other very much. But also their marriage was a political convenience marriage, but also it kind of was, yeah. Last time I read up on it, the situation was that Ashe is a war mother of Aatrox, and the society in the Freljord is very matrilineal and matriarchal, right? And so it's normal for war mothers to have many husbands. For example, they might have a husband from each of the tribes that they are the leader of, because that's sort of a way to socially cement like the political connections in the Freljord. Ashe herself had something like 7 fathers. Her mom had 7 husbands, and they don't know which one of them is like the genetic father of Ashe, but they know for damn sure who her mother is. And so she had like 7 dads. And Ashe was being pressured to like do that also as part of her political leadership of the Aatrox. Like, you have to take some goddamn husbands. That's what war mothers do. And she was like, I don't fucking want to. And there's like Tryndamere is this like smelly, raging battle hobo who was sort of in the Aatrox camp. And she's like, that one, I want that one. Sort of figuring that someone as terrifying and scary as him would scare off all other suitors. And then ostensibly from their marriage of convenience, where Tryndamere's tribe gained protection through his marriage with Ashe, and she gained, like, no other suitors want to fucking deal with this man. Ostensibly, they then developed, like, a real love and affection and a real relationship with one another kind of thing. But Riot has never fucking explored it. Never given us any stories, never given us any, which I think is a fucking bummer, first of all, because Ashe is kind of a popular and important character. And second of all, that seems like a real fucking interesting story that I'd like to hear. Riot, please, if you fucking care to update your goddamn champions and take care of your goddamn lore instead of rebooting it. Oh my god, I'm still salty about the arcane thing. We'll deal with that later. Anyway, also, character design. Ashe's character design here, since people are going to be asking me about it, Ashe's character design here seems to me to be like a modified version of the one she has in Legends of Runeterra, where she also, like, that, it has mostly the same sort of aesthetics, but here it's rendered in this, like, highly realistic style, this leather corset thing with, like, leather pauldrons and plates. The Runeterra design has more metal, I think, if I remember correctly. And it's not too dissimilar to the redesign that I made a couple of years ago also, for Ashe. Not that I think they've taken inspiration from me, rather that these are fairly obvious updates for her character design to make her look like she, you know, belongs in a place that is frozen most of the year and fucking cold, rather than she's running around in a sunny forest because she's an elf ranger, because that's what Ashe is. She's a direct copy of the Drow Ranger from Warcraft 3. Right, where were we? Storytelling, yes. I like the storytelling here. I like the use of, like, the color, that Ashe literally brings the color back into his life, that she literally, like, lights up his world. She is the light of his life. And that gets its final coda here. As we see this shot here, like, Ashe has brought the light, but it's still pretty fucking dark all over the place. And right there, they repeat the trick from the start of the thing, right? Where, like, at the start of the thing, Tryndamere is looking up and he sees this figure sort of hazily in the background of the whatever, and, like, he can sort of barely make out who they are. And then here, and, like, it could be Ashe, it could be Lamb, we don't know, we can't tell, and they do the same goddamn thing right here. Pay attention to the figure back there, moving around, where you have these 2 little sort of glinting bits of light, where it's like, oh, is that Is that Lamb, like, still sort of hanging around the edge? Or, oh, it's a Winter's Claw? Yeah, it's a Winter's Claw. Okay, it's Winter's Claw Warriors. Like, they sort of pull the same little bit itty-bitty subtle trick, and I really like that. I think that's really cool. But anyway, what Ashe does when they're confronted with, oh shit, we're surrounded still by Winter's Claw Warriors, and you can kind of see them approaching out of the edges here, is that she fires a Hawk Shot, and she lights up the world. Because Ashe lights up the world, she pushes back the darkness, right? She pushes back the shadow of death, and that's sort of where we leave it, like this. Like, I'm still here, I have survived, I have not succumbed to death. Great bookends. Like I will say, for everything that I'm going to be criticizing about this short, the Tryndamere Kindred Ashe section is really fucking good in terms of storytelling. Like, it's a really, really effective, like, setup and, like, exploration, and then a payoff at the end with this, like, very clear visual language that, like, this is what the light means. This is what, like, the warmth of color means, and, like, that's where we get the exploration of what it means for Tryndamere to have his battle rage, right? Like, to be the Undying. It's not a good thing for him. It's not nice. He doesn't like, it's not something that he enjoys, being the Undying, but it's, like, a burden that his love for Ashe helps him to lift and deal with. And I think that's excellent. Like, some very good visual storytelling here. Anyway, let's talk a little bit about the fight with Wolf and Lamb. Because it is, I still... the little trick where you can sort of see Lamb melt out of the shadows. Like, I think, again, no, I'm leaving that for the criticism section. I have my issues with the choice of aesthetic here, like that very sort of grounded, realistic sort of Diablo Blizzard Entertainment aesthetic, like generic AAA video game fantasy aesthetic, but in the execution of how they do it, it is excellently done, like the way they have the shadows of the Kindred fading in and out of things. Interesting design choice with Wolf also, to give Wolf a full proper body, right? Like, to make Wolf an actual freaking wolf rather than the hovering ghost spirit. I like this effect very much as well, where he's this darkness that just has like a lounging maw coming out of it. I think that's an interesting visual choice, and like, it comes from like the fact that, like, part of the reason why Wolf doesn't have a body in League of Legends is that if the Kindred was like Lamb with the arrows, and then this motherfucker like trotting alongside her, everyone would sort of expect, well, that's part of her hitbox, right? Like, if we hit Wolf, then we hit Kindred, right? Like, we hit the whole champion. And so instead, designing Wolf to be like this hovering spirit that sort of just orbits around Lamb, that creates a lot more gameplay clarity, that Lamb is like the primary character. That's the one you're aiming at. And Wolf is like more of a passive companion, sort of in the same way that Pix is a passive companion to Lulu. Like, so those are character design things, like, in game, you need to make those decisions about, like, we can't give them a hitbox that's that fucking big because they're supposed to be like a relatively squishy AD carry, and that's a big problem if they're much easier to hit with like a blitz hook or whatever. So that's a design choice that probably comes out of those gameplay considerations. But here, because we don't have to care about gameplay considerations, so fuck it, Wolf is a fucking Tibetan Mastiff, and also a dire wolf, and just the biggest, chunkiest wall of like fur and teeth you've ever seen in your life. And it worked great for this particular short as well, like, because it really emphasizes the contrast between Lamb and Wolf, which comes across in their animation, which is another thing that I really, really like, is that while Wolf is like constantly charging Tryndamere, wrestling with him, like, fucking I'll eat your face and your brains and whatever, Lamb just stands on the outside of the fight. She's just gently pacing, just like circling him from like outside of the ring of light, right? Like, Wolf charges into Tryndamere's space, like into the, if the light is life, right, in the center of the scene, then Lamb stays on the outside. Like, she doesn't violate this boundary of light. She doesn't step into the space of life. She just snipes gently from the outside, right? Just circling around him, analyzing him, looking at him. It is chilling. Like, that is sort of a thing that, like, that makes her genuinely kind of scary, which is something like, that's one of the weaknesses a little bit of Lamb as a character design, like as an embodiment of death, is that the way that she's usually rendered, she's not very spooky, right? Like, her character design doesn't naturally lend itself well to spookiness, which is a mild weakness in the Kindred character design, that the character designers just sort of couldn't resist making her adorable and kind of like attractive. She has a substantial bottom if you look at her character model in game, but framing her this way as like this thing that's hovering on the edge of your perception, just waiting for a moment when you slip up, when you're not paying attention, when you're not all there to resist her with all your might at every given moment. That's a scary thing. To be hunted by this lamb while Wolf is fucking coming at you, that's a scary situation to be in. That makes Lamb a lot scarier. And like this framing of her as this like just rock steady stare, unblinking, looking right at you, just circling you and waiting, observing Tryndamere from the outside, just looking for a moment when his attention isn't quite where it's supposed to be. And we can see here is where like the undying battle rage really kicks in. And when it does, Tryndamere is the one who leaves the circle of light, right? That's the other thing, is like the battle rage is bad. It's bad for him. It's not a good state for him to be in, is that when he enters the battle rage, he rushes out from the circle of life. He rushes directly into Wolf's mouth. Like he's rushing towards death defiantly, obviously, but he's running away from life. He's running away from that in order just to like indulge his battle rage. And you get this thing of like, oh, he broke her power and like he nearly injured her, and he just barely doesn't step over the edge, just barely. But then Lamb does a cool ass motherfucking backflip and lands, and yeah, like, no, that doesn't work. Of course that doesn't work. But we do get that little, like, again, a great little animation detail, that little head tilt that just kind of goes, oh, like, as though, like, that's novel, that's interesting. Lamb isn't worried. It's like, because Lamb is death. Why would Lamb be worried? But she's just kind of going, oh, this mortal is interesting. Like, again, the layers of storytelling that are going on with the animation of these characters is excellent. And one of the good things is that, like, even if you don't really know about Tryndamere's undying rage thing, a lot of this is accessible. Like, a lot of this is stuff that if you, like, pay attention to the imagery and like, you sort of understand that, okay, they are death and, like, this is the thing that's happening. He's fighting death here. You can kind of intuit a lot of what's going on, which is like one of the things that I really prize in trailers like this, is that you don't have to have read all of the fucking lore of League of Legends in order to understand what's going on here. That's another one of the criticisms we'll be talking about with the other segments. In the criticism segment, I'll try and restrain myself, but that's what I really like about this section, is that it's so accessible. Like, its visual language is... It's a little weird. It's like, why is there an arrow and a wolf? Like, that stuff is weird, but you can kind of intuit what the visual metaphor is here once you get the added context of, like, Kindred puts her bow down when Ashe arrives. And there's also this other thing, that we have this... there's this equivalence being drawn in the imagery between Tryndamere and Wolf, in that they are both, like, raging beasts, essentially. Like, they're both like these raging violent beasts fighting off attackers, like charging ahead. And then Ashe and Kindred, like, and there's this sort of contrasting counterpart thing being set up, that Ashe and Tryndamere are in life like as closely partnered two halves of a whole, in the same way that Wolf and Lamb are, right? Like, Wolf and Lamb are two halves of one person. And so I think the storytelling here is that, like, Ashe is as important to Tryndamere as Lamb is to Wolf, right? And that Tryndamere and Wolf has some characteristics in common, and Ashe and Kindred and Lamb have some characteristics in common. Like, that caution, like, that Lamb is the patient hunter who waits for the right moment to strike, while Wolf is there, I'll fucking eat you, like, charging ahead, barging into battle thing. And again, that is a little thing for the lore hounds, like the people who know the shit. But I like that as a little Easter egg just for us. Anyway, let's move on to the Kayle and Morgana section. So, Kayle and Morgana's section, in terms of the storytelling that it's trying to do, has to do a hell of a lot in a very compressed scale of time, right? Because the story is Kayle and Morgana are defending this city in Demacia, wherever, against an attack from Aatrox, right? Like, and the stuff they have to do in order to defend him. How do we establish the stakes of that so that the audience understands, like, well, why are these characters fighting? What's going on? Well, we start with the camera inside the gates of the city, right? Like, that's where we start. This is our side that we start on, where we are inside the city and we are looking out at all the terrible carnage, almost as though we're like a scared citizen poking their head up over the wall and kind of going, oh, is it over? Right. So we're in there. All of this seems to be, oh, okay, we're in here. The city's being attacked. Those are the bad guys, probably. And we look out there and it's just a field of corpses, none of which have actually been injured, but, you know, it's a field of corpses, and there's, like, artillery bits that have rained down and fires everywhere, and we have these two lone defenders on the battlefield, Kayle and Morgana. Now, how do we avoid making it look like Kayle and Morgana are the ones attacking the city? Well, we frame them with the city behind them. Right, like we make sure that the city is behind them and they stand in front of the city and look out towards the enemy. That's one of those, like, it's a very basic thing about, like, visual storytelling, but you could, like, make a mistake in terms of how you frame these two characters and accidentally imply that they're the ones who've been slaughtering everyone and who are attacking the city, when in fact they are the city's most stalwart defenders. So, good color coordination happen. Like, again, none of what I'm saying here is like stuff that's mind-blowing. It's just good basic craft that the battlefield, generally speaking, lots of fog, lots of blues, lots of grays, lots of cold, sort of muted colors. Same thing with the sky and everything. And then we have like the fires on the battlefield and the angry eye in the sky, like where Aatrox is hanging out, presumably launching whatever those things are at the battlefield. Those are like, oh, okay, that's destruction, that's evil, that's danger, and that's what the two sisters, being framed down here at the very bottom of the screen, are up against this, right? Like, it's these two up against that. And then there's also this, I don't know how intentional this is, but it seemed to me at least that this was like, oh, it's two angels fighting against something up in heaven. Except, of course, Aatrox is visually, once they get up there, Aatrox is visually much closer to our idea of like the devil or Satan or a demon or something like that. I don't know if they're playing with that intentionally or if that's just an accidental thing, but I thought it was kind of fun. Anyway, visual storytelling. So Kayle is the one who walks furthest forward, right? Like, when we get this shot, Morgana is completely still. She's just kind of standing there, just kind of looking, waiting to see what's happening. Kayle is more active. Like, she's more restless. She's the one who's moving around. She's the one who's stepping forward. She's the one who's looking up into the sky and going, right, I'm going to kick the ass of whatever's up there. And off she goes. And Morgana then follows. Now, this is where this segment of the cinematic has no time to establish anything. It has no time to establish any of the details of the relationship between these two characters, anything of the power dynamic between Kayle and Morgana. It doesn't even have time to establish like the importance of their swords, which is, again, I'm going to save it for the criticism section primarily, but it's one of those things of like, the swords are really, really important. They're going to be important later, and if you know the lore, if you are already familiar with League of Legends lore, then you get it. Then you see what's happening. But if you don't, then there's kind of no way to decode it. But Kayle, of course, is the one who goes off first, who charges into battle. Morgana then follows. And that sets up something that's going to be paid off a little bit later on down the short. And by the way, I quite like the flight animation that they've got going on here. Like, never mind whether the wings are of realistic size to carry them anywhere. They're not, but, you know, whatever. Magic. But I like the snappiness, right? Like, you can see the anticipation that's being built up here as, like, Morgana drops down low, the wings come out, and you see, like, she's charging up, essentially, her jump, and then zoom. Like, then we get, like, this burst of speed as she just, like, zoosh. Once again, Kayle in front, Morgana after, and then we see that Aatrox has anticipated them. And I quite, again, a lovely little animation direction thing here. Aatrox is coming in with a sword swing like that, right? You would expect that in order to dodge a sword swing coming down here, Morgana would go right, Kayle would go left. Instead, they cross over. Morgana goes left, and Kayle goes right. They zig when they should have zagged. And again, I'm sitting here like, I know a bunch of stuff about the character, the lore and the backstory of these two characters. How much should I read into this? But this to me is like, oh, okay. Like, Kayle and Morgana have a particular relationship in the sky, a particular way that they fight. Because when they're fighting Aatrox here, like, see, there again, they sort of cross one another's paths and swoop back, and then it's like Kayle, and then Morgana swoops in, and then, like, trying to do a coordinated attack. Whoop. Like, they have, like, the sensation that I get when I'm watching them in flight and fight is this sense of expert coordination. Like, these two sisters know exactly what the other one is going to do before anything even happens, right? They're very much in sync. But then also there's this thing of, like, they keep crossing each other's paths. There's this moment here where rather than block the hit, Morgana ducks under it, and then Kayle takes the hit instead, where it's like, the feeling I get watching them is like this sense of like a coordinated dance, right? Like a constant collaborative like battle with Aatrox, where they are constantly reading each other's moves, anticipating where the strategy is supposed to take them. But then on the other hand, there's this sense of like, when they cross each other's paths multiple times, when like Morgana dodges the blow and then Kayle takes it, that to me feels like maybe that's supposed to tell a story of lack of coordination, and I'm not 100% sure how then to read it. And when I'm not sure how to read something, well, like when I look very closely, carefully at the details and kind of go, there's probably what I'm meant to take away is that which comes to me intuitively. And what comes to me intuitively is this idea that they are fighting in sync, they are completely united in their purpose, they know exactly what the other one is going to do before they've even thought about it. And Aatrox is just too powerful for them to handle with those particular strategies. Like, that's the emotional takeaway I get from this fight scene. Even if I can't help but sort of read too much into the finer details of the thing. Anyway, fucking hell, I love the camera work on this. The camera work here is really, really good, because, like, we have this tracking camera following Morgana specifically, right? Like, it doesn't follow Kayle, who's the first one to break through the clouds and actually see Aatrox. It follows Morgana, so that we have enough time to see him coming forward here and just, like, barely missing Morgana as we get this speed ramp effect, which, again, is very effective. Like, at sort of demonstrating the power of the blow. Because imagine if this sequence was playing back without the speed ramp, and it was just, he just slashes, and then we immediately, without pausing, go into that next movement. It would be very hard to read. Oh, hang on. It would be very hard to read what's actually going on in the fight. So we get, like, this little dash forward, slash, and then we hold just the moment after the slash has finished with the speed ramp. As you can see, Aatrox is beginning to track around to, like, catch a look at Morgana. You can see that Kayle is, like, dodging under his wings. Also, a little character design note that I quite like. Kayle and Morgana's wings. Kayle's wings are very orderly here, right? Like, this is not really... It's partly something that's present in their League of Legends character designs. Kayle's wings are very straight, very strict, very orderly, right? Like, they're very organized and well put together. Morgana's wings look altogether more frayed. Like, altogether more rough and chaotic compared to her sisters, and that's a lovely little thing. It's a hard detail to actually see when the whole thing's going off, but I like it. And we get some nice distortion of the model here as Kayle, like, is dashing into frame. You see how like they've really emphasized the foreshortening on the character so that she's practically reaching out of the frame towards us as she's dashing down there. Aatrox spots her, and then we get this lovely little effect. I quite like that. Like, this whole sequence, by the way, is anime. Like, it's fully anime as shit. It's like super-powered characters clashing in the sky. We'll talk about that in criticism section as well. And they're leaning into that, like, by having Kayle hit Aatrox, not with the blade of her sword, but with the hilt, which I guess that's just him successfully blocking it. And we get this shockwave effect. Boom. As we get, like, another speed ramp where, like, time slows down for just a second. And then, woof, he knocks her away. And I love, like, the spin on Aatrox here. Like, he knocks Kayle away, swings around, and then he brings the sword over for an overhand slash where, like, the camera runs up his arm tracks the sword along, and then whoop, barely missing Morgana. Although here, here actually it does look a little bit like the sword passes through her wings. Not that you can see it, like it's so motion blurred it doesn't fucking matter, but okay. But this is like, the camera work is the thing I love the most about this fight, like the way that the shots track from the beginning, right? Like we're tracking Morgana, and we stay on her, and then like as she darts out of frame, then we go to Kayle, cut back to Aatrox, blocks the shot, and then as he knocks her out of frame, now he's being tracked, and we're tracking his sword, down around to Morgana, and then the camera doing these wild 3D swings, like up and down, left and right, so that gravity seems almost completely suspended, not just for the characters who are in flight, but for the camera itself, as the camera then tracks Morgana into the next thing where she's charging, and then whoop, dodges behind it, just below the blow. Kayle absorbs it. Now we're tracking Aatrox as Morgana is swooping around him. Swings at Kayle, here comes Morgana, grab. Like just the coordination and the flow of this scene, how every action that happens flows so naturally into the other. It's just damn good craft, man. And then as Aatrox yeets the hell out of Morgana, we track her down to the ground. Kayle soon to follow, kaboosh. And that's the end of that. And this all happens in, how long is it? Let me check. 38 seconds is about as long as that took. Like to do that, to set up the stakes, set up that, oh, okay, these are defenders of the city, they're fighting this guy and charging up into the sky. Oh no, he's very powerful, they can't actually beat him with their conventional tactics. Now here he comes, and Aatrox now rises, and like this is the all is lost moment, right? Like if you're working with like a classic 3-act structure, Aatrox landing and his army marching in behind him, and like the sun beating down on that horde of enemies charging as he's roaring, that's the all is lost moment, right? Like this is the hero's lowest point from which they need to rise in order to achieve a catharsis and then a resolution to their narrative. How do we retrieve our catharsis? Well, by activating our Bankai. That's basically what they're doing here, again, because this whole sequence is fucking anime, is like, okay, like I was trying to fight with only 10% of my power, but I see now that you're too powerful for that. So I'm gonna unleash my hidden, secret, forbidden technique. Bankai. That's basically what's happening here. And it works. Again, I will speak about this in the criticism section. It would have been cool if they had actually used an anime aesthetic for it, since that's the emotional vibe they want to go for. But it's being emulated well enough. And this is where we get to talk a little bit about the storytelling, right? Because if you know the lore, Kayle is motivated by her role as the aspect of justice. Like this relationship that Kayle has with her mother, where she's so desperate to step into her mother's shoes and be like become her mother in that sense. Like that's how she has responded to the abandonment issues that they both have, is that Kayle very much wants to like step into her mother's role, become her mother, to understand why her mother would leave them. Like that's her trauma. Morgana, on the other hand, has responded to like their mother's abandonment by going, well, fuck you too then. I'm going to take care of the people I have here around me right now. So Morgana is very deeply motivated by the love of people around her, right? Like she cares very much for the citizens of Demacia. She cares very much for her sister, her father, where Kayle has like retreated from all of those things and cares about the ideals, like the right way to do things, the perfect way to do things, etc., etc. The sword is an embodiment of the aspect of justice, which is the thing that Kayle wants to be more than anything else in the entire world. And so Morgana sees her beloved sister take an ass kicking, and the city under threat, and like this terrible thing coming down to destroy that, and she decides the way that she's going to respond to that, the way she's going to deal with that, stick the sword in the dirt and walk forward and solve this problem, not with the sword of the aspect of justice, but with her like dark magic powers or whatever, restraining the guy rather than directly taking him out. And that, for Kayle, this thing of like leaving behind the sword, of choosing any other method to deal with something except the aspect of justice, the sword, the weapon, that's, for Kayle, that's a very, very deep rejection of who she is and what she wants and how she thinks and the values that she has. And so we get this rather unpleasant expression on her face as she looks at her, says like, how could you possibly leave this sword behind. This sword is the most important fucking thing in the world, but fine, if you're not gonna use it, I will. And this is where, like, in terms of visual storytelling, rather than Kayle's wings and her eyes and shit lighting up, like, it would have been good if the swords... But it's also, it's this thing of, like, this thing is so fucking compressed. 70 seconds. That's all we have to tell everything, right? To tell everything that needs to be told. And so I can see as a directorial decision, let's not emphasize the swords. Let's not make those too important as objects. Let's emphasize, like, the characters themselves and the powers that they have, in order to sort of show the contrast and the differences between them. But it's about the swords. Like, emotionally, those are the stakes for the characters. And this is something, like, obviously I'm sitting here, I can tell that this is what's happening because I'm familiar with the lore. So as fan service, as, like, Easter eggs for the people who are like fans of League of Legends and who know the stories of these characters, it works excellent. Like, you get this shot that literally, like, that very specifically emphasizes the sword left behind on the foreground, and then Morgana walking away, dropping the helmet, walking towards Aatrox while having embraced, like, not the aspect of justice, but her own self, her own identity, which is the thing that Kayle is most desperate to reject. That's all really cool. I just wish that the short itself would be able to communicate that to casuals, right? Like, to people who don't instinctively understand these characters deeply. That would have been cool. I mean, I do wonder about Aatrox, like, I wonder if I'm supposed to read this as characterization of him. Like, Morgana's chains, like, come at him, and he doesn't even react, like he doesn't give a shit. He just kind of goes, yeah, fuck you, I'm just gonna strain against them and I'm gonna break them. Because that feels true to Aatrox to an extent, that, like, he would be restrained by something like this and he'd just go, yeah, you know, you've bought yourself 10 seconds, I'm just gonna smash them. I'm just gonna break this shit and then I'm gonna kill you. But I don't know whether to read that as characterization or whether to read it as this power works so well because this is Morgana's Bankai moment. And it kind of needs to in order for the moment to be emotionally satisfying. This is the other thing about their power relationship, right? Like, Morgana gives everything of herself, right? Like, she uses all of this power. It's extremely strenuous of her. She sacrifices of herself. She gives of herself in order to save the people around her. Kayle doesn't. Like, Kayle taps into her divine power, right? Like, this, like, Morgana's powers technically in terms of the lore are also divine. They also come from being part of the aspect of justice. But in terms of the visual storytelling between how these two characters solve problems is Morgana gives of herself, and Kayle, she doesn't sacrifice, she overwhelms, she overpowers, right? And that, again, sort of says something about the relationship of the sisters to each other, the way they conceptualize the powers, the way they use them. Kayle is the avenging angel, and Morgana is the person who tries to make the fighting just stop, right? Which I wish would be clearer to casuals, but whatever. We get one little last lovely Easter egg. As the fire burns, consumes Aatrox, doesn't kill him, he can't die, which he's very mad about. We get this figure, ever so subtly, just sort of appearing in the flames. The figure of Lamb, holding her bow, that we get this brief appearance in the flames before we swap over to the Yasuo section. So, let's talk about Old Man Yasuo. Well, someone on the cinematics team watched Logan, I guess. Old Man Yasuo. Now, this one was a surprise for a lot of people. Like, I've watched a bunch of other reaction videos to this cinematic, and a lot of people don't clock that this is Yasuo. Like basically until the end of the thing, they're still kind of like, was that Yasuo? Was that supposed to be Yasuo? I kind of didn't get it. And there's a couple of reasons for that. This is supposed to be the moment when you first go, oh, like, this is supposed to be the moment where you kind of go, oh shit, is that, oh, is that, like, you're supposed to be, like, kind of weighing up the possibility in your mind there because of the scar, right? Like, because this is the iconic Yasuo scar across his nose, which is like a really prominent part of his character design. It vanishes a little bit in the aesthetic here, that it's so realistic that, oh, is this supposed to be like an iconic scar, or is that just like he's got a blemish across his nose? Like, it can be a little bit hard to read it for what it is. But even here, like, when we get the ponytail and we get, like, the full reveal of the thing, I saw a lot of people being like, oh, is that Yasuo's master instead of being master? Why the hell am I saying it like master instead of Yasuo? And that's like, yeah, that's too bad. And that again comes down partly to the time compression, that this little 70-second section of the cinematic just doesn't have time. Like, it just doesn't have time to establish things beyond the surface level, and it just sort of expects you to be able to keep up by having, like, intricate League of Legends knowledge in advance, which is like, yeah, again, I wish it was more accessible to casuals. But putting all of that aside, we'll talk more about it in the criticism section, I'm sure. Let's talk about the actual thing itself. And there's a couple of things. I've talked about like light and color and how it's used in the storytelling and stuff like that. One of the things I do want to point out also is that the director and like the cinematographer of the cinematic have been very careful about how to present the light in each scene. Like, we're working in this like sort of grounded, realistic-esque aesthetic, but Tryndamere, we have like this warm, like winter late day sunlight, lots of whites, lots of like grays, like lots of winter colors going on here. And then as when we're in the death realm with Kindred, we have like this very desaturated, very cold, very blue light. That's the Tryndamere section. When we're in Kayle and Morgana, we get like the battlefield, which is like, yeah, it's dark and gray, but it's not cold in the same way that the colors in Tryndamere section are. The light isn't muted in the same way that the colors in the Tryndamere section are. It is this like dark, desolate battlefield, but there's a lot more visual drama, a lot more visual variety and interest going on. And then as we head up into the sky, we get like, yeah, golden light again, kind of like in the scene with Tryndamere, but a different set of color temperatures. And like a very different vibe and aesthetic, right? And this is something I quite appreciate, because like then we get into the Yasuo section, and everything here is just soaked in orange, right? Like everything here is soaked in gold and red and orange because everything is on fire. This is like a burning village scene. And so even this is one of the things I want to praise about like the way they have handled having to have the time compressed so much that there's no time to establish different locations, that you can tell intuitively when you're watching this thing that these three scenes are completely disconnected from one another, right? Like as we transition out of Tryndamere, seeing someone approaching in the distance and everything goes dark, waking up on the battlefield with Kayle and Morgana, we're not thinking, oh, did he teleport? Like, is this happening in the same thing? Are these the people that he saw? There's no confusion there, because visually it is so explicitly distinct from one another in terms of the color, in terms of like the stage direction, in terms of the mise en scène, the cinematography, film studies words that I don't fully know. It's all very carefully calculated to make sure that you understand from the transitions that are happening, which is like here with like from Kayle and Morgana to Yasuo with the flames. These are not the same place. These are not the same time. These are not the same characters. These are not stories that flow directly into each other. These are vignettes that are thematically related to one another. So the village. We established, again, we're doing this thing of like, we have to establish the stakes. We have to establish like, why are we fighting? What's the risk here? So we have this framing where we begin with flames and fire. Then the first two figures we see are masked dudes with swords. And the masks, like, this is a character design thing. When you deny someone access to a human face, when you deny someone access to seeing a person's eyes and their face, you deny access to their humanity to an extent. Like, that's why Lamb was successfully able to be creepy in their sequence, is because you had this mask with the two glowing eyes just staring, but no hint of any humanity inside of it, which is why you should never unmask Lamb either for the skins, Riot. Stop doing it. It's very annoying. Stop doing it. So we have like this thing with two dark black eye holes and this guy with like a demon mask. But then we have a person, like a person whose face we can see, who we can identify, center frame, running away from the thing that these two people are doing. So we get, okay, right, instantly, like within the first second and a half of this thing even being on screen, or yeah, like the first 4 or 5 seconds, we have established exactly what the stakes are. These guys are doing evil stuff. They're the reason why this thing is on fire. She's running away from them. Here are our stakes. How is our hero going to respond to the peril at hand? Well, he's going to appear somehow, just sort of like show up, poof, out of nowhere, and draw a line in the sand. And that's just like, as a move to introduce a character, it's very badass, right? Like, he's not charging out at them. He's not like fighting them or attacking them or anything. He's just kind of going, yeah, this far, no further. Just stay on the other side of that, and we're not gonna have a problem, right? Everything's gonna be fine if you just don't step over that line. And then like a little moment of these two characters like looking at each other, kind of going, old man stepping in to save someone. We have never watched a movie or read a story, so we understand that when an old mysterious man appears suddenly to defend someone in a perilous situation, the smart thing is to immediately attack him. Oh, no narrative awareness. Poor fools. But this is not a story about Yasuo being an unkillable, like unstoppable champion. Just like kicking ass and taking names and saving the day. It's first of all a story about Yasuo being rather too late to save the day. You'll notice, like, the village is already burning. There's already there's corpses on the ground. People are very dead. And Yasuo only shows up here at the very last moment to save someone who might very well be the last survivor of this village, right? So this is not Yasuo triumphantly defending, like, this is not like Kayle and Morgana, who are managing to defend a city against an entire army. This is rather the opposite of that. This is a man who's like, this far and no further, right? Like, you have gone this far, not the woman and her child. Like, at least those two. Not those two, right? This is a man trying to save a very small part of the world, rather than trying to save the whole world, right? So he's kind of already failed a little bit, and he's sort of stepping in with nothing but a stick and a cool, intimidating scar over his nose to deal with these guys. And if this was a heroic narrative, like if this was like a badass, yeah, like this is when the hype kicks in and things pump up, he would easily take these two guys out, right? And that's what you expect to happen, because like that guy charges at him, whack him with a stick, sword in the ground. That guy comes at him, easily parried, and kerschmack, right? Everything's proceeding according to plan so far. This is what we expect from these kinds of mysterious heroes steps in at the last second to save the day narratives. And then the other guy pulls a knife, and this is like, you look at Yasuo here, like he's still looking at the other guy he's fighting. He sort of barely spots this guy coming. And like, that's not a super elegant martial arts dodge. That's getting out of the way like, oh shit, fuck. Oh god, oh hell, oh fucking hell. And then taking a swing, and then this is visual storytelling. The staff breaks. Like his weapon, his power, his ability to deal with these guys shatters upon impact. And he takes a rather nasty kick right to the hell in the ribs, because he's not taking these guys down, like, without even looking, teleporting behind them and saying nothing personnel, kid. He's struggling. And this is about vulnerability, right? This is not Yasuo in his prime. This is not Yasuo saving an entire village by, like, charging into a battle and, like, taking out half the army by himself, like in the Awaken cinematic. This is one guy struggling pretty hard to save, like, two people, after having already been too late to make a real difference. And you get this sense here, like there's this moment of Yasuo standing up, and we get this sword stuck in the ground, and his broken staff, and he like throws that down, and then the guy calls for an arrow shot, and you see Yasuo close his eyes, and it's almost as though like, oh, is he just gonna let it hit him? Like, there's this moment of ambiguity where it's like, is he gonna let it hit him? And then he kind of goes, nope, fuck you, I'm a swordsman. And again, set up, right? Why doesn't Yasuo already have his sword here? Like, what, like, and that's not a criticism, it's a question. It's like, where did that go? Like, what happened to part him from his blade? When that's one of the very important parts of him and his identity is his sword, and like his relationship to his martial art and his craft and like and all of that. Like, where did that all go? Which is where I wish this thing would have had more setup. No, leave that for the criticism section. Whatever. Wind wall, cool as shit. And it establishes something interesting for later. Like, because we get this barrage of arrows coming in on the order of the commander, and Yasuo just kind of goes, nope, that doesn't work on me, because I'm Yasuo, and fuck you. And the moment he displays his wind powers, like, this guy seems to know what's up, right? Like, this guy's like, oh, fuck, it's one of the fucking wind school people. Shit, okay, bye! Like, he instantly knows, I don't want to be here. I've heard stories about this shit. I need to get the fuck out of here. And we get this visual storytelling where, like, this bandage that Yasuo is wearing on his arm, as he unclenches and the wind begins to flow, it begins to push the bandage off of him, right? Which, again, this is a thing of, like, I'm sort of reading too far into it, I think, because he's using a bandage to cover himself up here, right? So he's covering up his wind power, he's covering up, like, his mastery of this old martial arts. That seems to be the idea, because the skin bio of the old man Yasuo skin, which looks substantially more spectacular than this version of him, says that this is a version of Yasuo who's, like, at the end of his life, when he's very old, he spent most of his life wandering just in guilt and shame and sort of denying his past, denying who he is. And so this would be the moment of him, like, taking off these coverings, all of these things that hide him, in the same way that his hat was used to hide his identity. Now this part of him is being shed as well. Like, his identity is no longer being hidden. It's pushing its way out from inside of him, and he's stepping into himself, kind of thing. It's like a moment of self-realization, self-actualization. I think that's what it's meant to be, but bandages usually are also about wounds, right? Like, so the bandage is coming off because he doesn't need it to help him with an old wound anymore. Like, if the wound is emotional, then it's because he's like, oh, I'm going to accept my guilt and step back into being who I am, kind of thing. And that would be a story that makes sense for Yasuo. The problem is that it's a story that's already been told about like 12 or 15 times. Like, it seems to be the only story that Riot knows how to tell about Yasuo, is like how he finally forgives himself. He's done it in the cinematic with Yone. He has done it in the fucking Ruined King game. They sort of implied that his like, him taking on Talia as a pupil was part of him, like, sort of learning to forgive himself. And now we have this thing where, oh, look, it's old man Yasuo with all of his guilt and shame learning to forgive himself. And it's like, maybe we could have a different story about Yasuo at some point, right? It's a good story. It's very hype. But maybe we could also tell other stories about him. I'm just saying. Anyway, Wind Wall. I love the little detail that the Wind Wall doesn't stop anything except projectiles. That's just a nice little thing. And vulnerability once again. Like I said, this thing is not about an unstoppable superhero, like easily conquering all challenges laid before him. This is an old man's last stand, right? So now having embraced his powers, his skills, his abilities, like sort of found himself again, now he's able to dispatch the goons, right? Like, now he's able to deal with those guys. Boom. There's, like, tap him with a sword. They fall over, apparently unwounded. We'll talk about that later. And, like, as he keeps going, more and more, like, the bandages get shattered and cut open, and, like, more and more of himself comes out, right? Like, this is this moment of self-actualization where he's embracing that which is below the surface of himself. Chases the bandit guy to the end of the village. Big barrage of arrows. And now, remember what's been set up here already. Yasuo can just do a wind wall, and then the arrows can't hit him, right? He has the option to not get hit by the arrows if he wants. But instead, boom, decides to Q that guy. And not use his ult on him, unfortunately, but, like, just decides to smack that guy with a tornado because fuck you. Presumably this kills him. Like, that's what that is supposed to do. It's supposed to kill a guy. And I quite like the way that the camera tracks this, because, like, you see how fast it looks like this guy's running? Just because, like, we really want that sense of high-speed impact when the tornado actually hits him and, like, takes him out. And then, there's Wolf. Showing up in the trees. The face of the wolf looking over him, looking down on him. And if you remember League of Legends lore, when you are confronted with death in the world of Runeterra, you have roughly two options, right? Like, well, it's more complicated than that, but fuck it. Like, just the basic story is you have two options. You can struggle against death, you can defy it, you can fight back against it, or you can accept it. And if you struggle and fight back against it, you get Wolf. Wolf is gonna hunt you, and Wolf is gonna get you at some point or another. Like, run, fight as much as you can, Wolf will get you. If you accept it, though, you get the swift and merciful and quiet death of Lamb's arrow. So here, we see Yasuo, like, spending his wind power, as it were, taking down the guy when there's a whole swarm of arrows towards him, closes his eyes, and as the rest of the arrows seem to slow down in time and we see Wolf's face ever more clearly in the trees, one arrow, blue and bright, streaks out from the crowd of these red-toned, sort of brownish arrows straight into, like, our character, right? So the implication here being that in this moment, Yasuo chooses to take out the bandit leader rather than use his wind wall to protect himself and defend himself further, would rather, like, make sure that that guy can never hurt anyone else ever again. And in doing so, he accepts death. Which is interesting. And again, this is not how Yasuo canonically dies. It's a vision. Okay, the way that they've explained it afterwards is that Yasuo has a dream vision, and he sees this vision in his dream of this is what would happen to him if he, like, got too absorbed by his guilt, is that eventually he would be in this village when it's attacked and would refuse to help until finally he's like, no, fuck it, I'm stepping back onto my path. And it's both a warning and something that's supposed to be reassuring, right? That it's this vision that Yasuo interprets as, like, my path is always waiting for me. Even at the last moment, I can still step back onto my path and embrace who I am and, like, accept who I'm supposed to be and so on and so forth. And I think the skin, Old Man Yasuo skin, is implying that in doing so, in stepping forward, like, defeating that guy, accepting his death, he gains enough access to himself that he's able to summon a wind wall and survive the arrow barrage, which I feel rather undercuts the whole fucking point of the sequence. If he's just if he quietly accepts his death and that's his moment of self-actualization, but then, oh no, wait, he's just a Deus Ex Machina, he super wind walls or whatever, and something, but fuck it, that doesn't matter. What matters here is that this all works really well. Like the storytelling sequence that's going on here is really cool. Some great animation as well, like just especially the goons. I'm really fond of these two goons, the way that they're rendered, like the way that they're so, like, the first thing we see of them in this shot as the woman is falling down is the sword comes into frame, like the threat, right? Like, we know what they intend to do to her. Immediately we understand, okay, they're gonna fucking kill her and the baby because they're bad guys, they're evil goons. But the way that they're sort of sauntering forwards, like, yeah, we're just gonna have a nice time murdering a lady, dude. Like, they're so chill about it, like so casual. I'm not saying that's good or cool. I'm just saying I like that as an animation choice for these two guys. Like, just sort of sword up on the shoulders, like, yep, it's just another day at the office kind of thing. And the way that the goon, right, as he's walking forward, you see him adjusting his grip on the blade, like that little finger flourish that's happening down there as he's, like, getting a stronger grip on it. Well, time to stab another innocent to death. Just a normal day at the evil goon factory. And then this thing of, like, he spots Yasuo first, and then the other guy kind of go, oh, there's an old man there all of a sudden somehow. And the drawing, like, I like that the first introduction to Yasuo is not anything of him, but the fact that he's drawing a line in the sand, right? Like, that's the first thing. The character, that comes second. The first thing that happens is someone draws a line in the sand. Who is that someone? We don't know yet. And they're kind of like, well, who's this nobody? Who cares? And then we get, oh no, it's not a nobody. This is a somebody. This is a you're about to get taken out in an old man's tragic last stand, guys. And, like, Yasuo has this thing of, like, the goon threatens him, basically is telling him to step out of the way, right? And Yasuo just kind of goes, nah. And I like I get such a sense of indignation from this guy as, like, what do you mean no? Right? It's like that scene of, like, put your hands up. No. Why not? I don't want to, but I have a gun. I don't care. Like, it's that energy a little bit as, like, Yasuo just sort of looks up and ignores him, and the goon kind of goes, but I threatened you. I have a sword. I threatened you. What do you mean no? Like the way that his shoulders fall, right? He looks so dejected. He looks like, but sword. And then he gets mad, right? Like, then he immediately gets angry. But there's this moment of, like, the sword comes down, the relaxation, like, almost like surprise. And then you can see the tension rising inside of him, right? Like, you can see how he begins to tense his muscles. He begins to get ready. Shoulders come up. Then the head comes down. And then into the attack. And, like, how his guy is like, oh, shit, we're doing this? Yep, all right, I'm with you. I'm right there. It's very good. Like, just as character animation for these two random goons who are just going to get taken out. Also, by the way, ow. Walk. Like, look at how long his neck gets for a second there. Bonk, 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 bonk. And then we get, like, speed ramping. Like, where, like, we get, again, the same thing as with Aatrox, right? Like, Yasuo spins, delivers the hit. Everything slows down. We get a moment of slow motion to really take in the hit. And then move on to the next part of the sequence. It's, like, just... There's a lot of good character animation going on here, is what I'm trying to get at. There's a lot of really good, subtle use of posture and movement and, like that little gesture of, like, adjusting your grip on the sword before you're about to do violence kind of thing that the goon does. That's all. There's a lot of good craft here. Beyond all the problems I have with it, there's just a lot of damn good craft going on right here. That I quite like. This guy is so fucking dirty. Like, is that chest hair, or is he just... But wow, that guy is dirty. He's just the filthiest man. Like, what the hell have you been doing? Are you supposed to be the commander? Don't you get people to do your dirty work for you? What the hell, guy? Take a shower. Jesus, if you'd taken a shower, maybe you wouldn't have gotten killed. But yeah, like, Yasuo's sequence is all about choosing something to die for, right? Like, Kayle and Morgana is this thing of, like, defying death in order to defend others, and Yasuo is like, this is finding something to die for, right? Like, that seems to be the story that they're telling here, and that's also part of the contrast between Yasuo and the leader, right? It's like, the leader is like, he's perfectly willing to send other goons to do his killing. He's happy to, like, summon swarms of arrows from out of frame somehow with a gesture of his hands. But he's not willing to die for something. Like, oh, this guy's a threat? Well, I'm fucking off. Bye. Deal with him for me. Right? He's a coward. He will not die for anything. He does not choose a hill to die upon. And Yasuo is about to teach him a lesson about that. Which I quite like. That's the contrast, like, between the hero and the villain, right? Like, hero is willing to die for something. The villain is not willing to even get a little bit hurt for anything. I just can't help it with this shot, though, like, because clearly this swing, boom, right through the shoulder. Like, we can see the trail penetrating. The sword is going through the shoulder, and then we get this shot. It's like, oh, no, don't worry. He didn't hit him. Yasuo missed, actually. Nothing happened. Don't worry about it. But, you know, whatever. Doesn't matter. What matters is cool guy Yasuo swinging a sword around, being awesome. That is the choreography and the character animation in this sequence is excellent. Like, it really is very, very good. And I think that's probably about all I have to say about Yasuo, which brings us pretty much to the end of this. Again, love the use of, like, high speed. Like, this guy's running 400 miles an hour through this sequence just to make the hit land more. It's really good. This is like a wallpaper right there. That's gorgeous. That's another thing, is, like, the way that Yasuo, with, like, you see Wolf's face, right? It's not there here, but the eyes appear as we see all of these arrows, like, just, there's like 500 archers out there, and every single one of them are using aim hacks. Just trying to headshot this one guy. Every single arrow is pointing straight towards him, and Wolf's face appears. And this is like the moment of, like, Yasuo needs to choose how to respond to the specter of death. And he does that with acceptance. But the thing I wanted to say, the color, right? That there's a great contrast between Yasuo all lit up in, like, extremely dramatic, deeply unrealistic lighting, I will say. Like, really with the edge lighting really highlighting him, this dramatic action pose, and then the dark, murky uncertainty of the forest beyond, right? Like, it's all kind of blurring together. It's all kind of vague and shadowy, and it's impossible to see what lies ahead, because it's, again, confrontation with death, confrontation with the unknown. It's all good. But anyway, that is all I have to say about the animation of this thing. TLDR, if you've been... It's probably gonna be an hour, isn't it? It's gonna be a fucking hour. If if you weren't getting it, I like a lot of the craft that's on display here. Like a lot of the technical animation work, a lot of just the cinematography and the use of film language, I think is excellent. I've had a very good time with it, but big but. I love big butts, I cannot lie. And here comes an extended section on some criticisms that I also have of how this thing was put together. At the start of Season 2023, Riot did not release a seasonal cinematic. According to Riot themselves, they had started production on one, but then some unspecified problems happened in production, and ultimately, although it was a painful decision, they had to cancel the whole thing. Now, this happens in animation sometimes. It's difficult, it's labor-intensive to produce, there's 100,000 things that can go wrong, and no matter how big a company is or how much money you throw at it, sometimes an animation project just cannot be finished on time or to the desired quality. However, instead of treating their players with the bare minimum of respect, instead of communicating, instead of simply saying, hey, here's what happened, we're really sorry, we can't give you a cinematic this year, we're working on something to make up for it, Riot decided to load up Unreal Engine with an ugly model of Summoner's Rift, make the camera fly around a little bit, and have a voice actor read out a not very good reference-laden poem, while some esports noises played in the background. Someone in Riot's management decided that the players are swine, undiscerning and unintelligent hogs who will slobber up whatever garbage they are served. They decided that a cinematic that looks like a cheap 2012 tech demo was good enough to replace one of the marquee highlight moments of the year for League players, and furthermore that those players are too stupid to know the difference. It was a show of contempt. Contempt for their players, who they were treating like idiots, and honestly, also contempt for their staff. Can you imagine being one of the workers at Riot who would have sunk probably months of work into pre-production on a planned cinematic? Storyboarders, writers, artists, animators, technical artists, like even a 4-minute cinematic trailer takes a huge team of people, a hell of a lot of work to even plan, much less actually make. And then some management jackass with a portfolio full of NFTs and cryptocurrency tells you to your face that this is an equivalent replacement for all of your fucking hard work that's just gonna get thrown out? It is contemptuous. It's contemptuous of the value of creative work, and it's contemptuous of the audience. The player base responded to this condescension in much the way that you would expect, forcing Riot very soon thereafter to issue an apology and an actual goddamn explanation like they should have given in the first place. And as they have done so many times in the past, the company very earnestly promised to do better. The Season 2024 cinematic, thus, should be understood in large part as Riot's apology letter for last year. This is their attempt to win back some good faith and some trust. And while for the most part the cinematic certainly seems to have been successful in this regard, like, that's a lot of views on the damn thing, and while I certainly like it, it is not without its flaws. And I think some of those flaws come specifically from Riot's rush to fix their PR problem. I have given the cinematic the praise it is due, so now let's talk about its problems. Still Here has chosen for its storytelling a realistic aesthetic. Not realistic as in actually looking like reality, mind you, it's still firmly fantasy, but realistic in the sense of being highly rendered. Every hair strand and follicle, every pore of skin visible on the characters, there's physics simulation out the wazoo, textures so detailed you can practically feel them under your nails, and light naturalistically glinting off every metal surface. It's an aesthetic which I've come to identify increasingly as the every AAA video game trailer aesthetic. You can see it a lot in Blizzard's products. Diablo, StarCraft, and Warcraft all use an aesthetic that's rather comparable to this for their cinematics and cutscenes and trailers, but tune into any edition of the Game Awards and you'll see a half-dozen trailers using this exact same style of high-fidelity rendering in an attempt to communicate to the audience the idea of high production value. The trouble is that although this aesthetic is definitely visually impressive, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the right tool for telling every kind of story. For example, Tryndamere's scene in this story has him hovering on the precipice between life and death, essentially delirious and hallucinating, fighting visions of lamb and wolf while his body is battle-raging against the Winter's Claw. It looks fine in the high realism style, which emulates ghostly and otherworldly effects well enough for the battle scene with the Kindred, but what if instead Tryndamere's scenes had been rendered with something like the painterly style from Annie Origins. The feeling of dreamlike unreality could have been greatly supported by an aesthetic like this, especially the Kindred fading in and out of the shadows as they fight Tryndamere, and a less realistic style with more abstraction would make it possible to push the character much further in their expression. Tryndamere in this scene is defying the very forces of life and death with the bottomless power of his rage. But the grounded, realistic visual style means that the only visual expression of that rage is that his eyes are red. Like, that's really all that's happening to him, and that's a little bit underwhelming visually. When Ashe's arrows fly into the shot and pull him back from the brink, all the cinematic can do to show that transition is change the lighting and brighten the frame, which works, again, well enough, but a more stylized and abstract form of animation could do so much more to really push this moment, where the love that he feels for another person is literally resurrecting him from a near-death state. On a similar note, Kayle and Morgana's fight with Aatrox is, as I've mentioned, basically anime. It's a scene of high-powered flying sword fighters clashing in the air, crashing down to the ground, and then, when all hope seems lost, our heroes get to their feet, summon their inner strength, and say, Bunkai. And boom! They unleash their ultimate powers. Like, again, the realistic style looks fine. It does this well enough. But if that's the kind of battle scene you want, if that's the kind of story you want to tell, there are entire genres of animation and aesthetics that are purpose-built to deliver that kind of hype. Riot has even used them before. Think of the Soul Fighter cinematic, Kin of a Stained Blade, Spirit Blossom, Gun Goddess Misfortune. Stylization is almost always a better vehicle for heightened, superpowered combat scenes than realism, because stylization can be bigger than reality. So why choose this realistic aesthetic to tell such a heightened, superpowered story? The place where the high realism style works the best, I think, is in the old Man Yasuo scene, because that scene is about Yasuo's age and frailty and vulnerability. Here, the realism shines because it can portray all the wrinkles and lines and shabbiness of his old age, and by making him look so close, relatively speaking, to a real human, and by making the scene so grimy and dirty and visually grounded, it imparts a sense of humanity. Yasuo here is not a stylized, larger-than-life superhero. He's an old man taking a stand. But even here, when the visual style is working, when it's doing exactly what it's supposed to do, it has one huge and completely unsolvable problem. In this scene, which we are supposed not to understand as a cartoon, not to understand as abstracted or stylized, Yasuo repeatedly slashes his sword through the bodies of other human beings and does no damage to them. Not even their clothes are cut, and not a drop of blood is spilled. Now, the reason for this is obvious. It's right at the start of the cinematic. This is rated T for teen. You can't show people getting their arms chopped off or their bodies cut in half with blood spraying everywhere, and you especially can't show those things in a highly realistic style if you want to maintain that rating. And so, the scene ends up a little bit at war with itself. On the one hand, it wants to have the sense of peril and vulnerability that comes from the realistic style, but on the other hand, it wants abstraction and distance from realistic violence. The result is that Yasuo's fight with the Raiders looks less like the brutal last stand of an old warrior against overwhelming odds, and more like a stage play where the extras dramatically fall over at the barest touch of the leading man's rubber sword. Much in the same way that censors in Western markets will throw a fit at anything that has a woman's nipple visible in it. That's pornography, don't you know? There are markets in the world that have similarly strict restrictions on the depictions of blood and gore and dangerous violence. And since Riot very much wants to advertise their product to children, those are restrictions that Riot is unwilling to violate. Which again raises the question, why choose this grounded, realistic style, then? If you already know that you can't possibly take advantage of it, if you know that you can't show a drop of blood, if you know that you can't show someone's clothes being cut by a realistically rendered, sharp-edged sword, why do it this way? Okay, this is me in the editing. I'm just going to cut in here with an interlude in anticipation of some comments that people might leave. A common interpretation of the Yasuo scene that I've seen is that he's using his wind powers, specifically not to hurt the raiders, that he's just, air quotes, knocking them out because people think the source of his shame is the violence that he's had to do and he doesn't want to kill anymore. And number one, I think that's a nonsensical interpretation of this scene. It proposes that the reason Yasuo picks up the sword is to not do any harm to the men who were about to cheerfully stab a mother and a baby to death in the middle of a burning village full of civilian corpses. Yasuo picks up a sword to propose a pacifist solution to the ongoing conflict. It also proposes that when the enemy commander runs, which in a non-violent scenario would be the end of the conflict, like when the enemy leaves, that is the non-violent victory. Instead, though, Yasuo chases this man with relentless determination, absolutely carving through his underlings so that he can gently push him with a tornado, save him from the rain of arrows that the commander himself is actively calling in, and which, if you look a little bit more closely, you'll notice has every single arrow pointed specifically, directly at Yasuo and wouldn't even have hit the commander. Number two, I also think that it's a nonsensical interpretation of Yasuo's character. The whole point of Yasuo's wind technique is that it is more deadly than simply cutting someone with a sword, and the reason that Yasuo is crushed by guilt and shame isn't that he's ashamed that he's had to do violence in his life, he's ashamed that he ran away from his responsibilities and the consequences of that violence. When he was a young and impatient man, he ran away from his master to join the war against Noxus, and because Yasuo wasn't there, his beloved master was killed, and Yasuo got accused of the murder. Then Yasuo runs away again from the accusation of murder, and because he runs away, Yone is sent after him and Yasuo ends up killing him. Yasuo's shame is about running away from his responsibilities, running away from his mistakes and from himself, and it is about the damage that his negligence causes to other people. The entire climax of Kin of the Stained Blade is about this central theme.
I'm no murderer. Then why are you running? I'm done running.
So when Yasuo picks up a sword and decides to start using the deadly wind technique, the whole point of which is that it is deadly, he's not rejecting violence, he's taking responsibility for it. He's accepting his responsibility as a warrior to use his skills to defend other people, the thing that he failed to do when he left his master to die. If Yasuo's story in this cinematic is about non-violently sparing the lives of a bunch of violent raiders, then I have a whole new set of criticisms about how badly made and stupid this scene is, because this might be the dumbest visual language possible to use to try and tell that kind of a story. No, Yasuo doesn't cut anyone here because censorship prohibits the cinematic from showing that kind of violence. It is the same reason that Tryndamere is lying on the snow and is supposed to be barely clinging onto life despite being visibly completely uninjured. It is the same reason Tryndamere is surrounded by the corpses of warriors that he has killed with a big jagged sword, somehow without drawing a single drop of blood, and it is the same reason why Kayle and Morgana don't get so much as a bloody nose from being power slammed into the ground by a demigod. The reason the cinematic doesn't show blood and injury is censorship. Yasuo's story isn't about heroically embracing non-violence. In the cartoony card game Legends of Runeterra, this is what Tryndamere looks like in a battle rage. But in this highly realistic AAA ray tracing on, all settings cranked to ultra prestige cinematic, he can't even have a bruise. As nice as the highly rendered style looks on the surface, it is not only not the best aesthetic tool to tell these stories, it is the visual style that is by far the most vulnerable to restrictions of censorship, which keeps undercutting the sense of vulnerability, frailty, and peril that the storytelling is trying to explore. Beyond the problem of aesthetic, though, the cinematic also has another problem, and it's a problem of time. Still Here is based around a 4-minute musical single. This is a format that Riot is very fond of using, and it's an extremely effective one, because plenty of people will throw the cinematic into a playlist just to listen to the music, and every time someone listens to the song on Spotify, it has the potential to work as secondary marketing, by reminding anyone who's seen the cinematic of the product that the song was attached to. 4 minutes, though, is also a pretty strict time limit, and when that time limit has to be shared by 7 champions across 3 entirely separate storylines, those stories necessarily have to be brutally compressed. Kayle and Morgana's section probably suffers the worst from this. There's technically a really nice bit of emotional storytelling going on between the two of them, embodied in the significance of their swords, but it gets almost entirely lost because the scene doesn't have any time to develop it. Kayle and Morgana wield the sword of the aspect of justice, which was split in two with half given to each of them. Symbolically, this represents their unity of purpose, their shared determination to embody justice on Runeterra. It is both their bond of duty and their bond as a family. So when they're beaten back by Aatrox and Morgana rises to use her ultimate, it is significant that she chooses to leave the sword behind. The cinematic even calls attention to it, meaningfully framing it standing there, abandoned in the ground as she walks forward. That decision to forsake the sword of their mother in favor of sorcery is a big part of why Kayle gives her sister that extremely dirty side-eye. But the only way to understand that, the only way to get what's going on here, is to already know what the sword means. If you haven't read their lore, the swords don't mean anything to you, and there is no way to intuit their meaning because the cinematic itself doesn't have time to establish it. It has 70 seconds, all of which has to be spent on the fight with Aatrox. A fight, by the way, which could have used a little bit more time to breathe. Like, Kayle and Morgana get to exchange maybe 4 or 5 blows with Aatrox before they're falling to the ground, collapsed and exhausted, and having a little bit more time to show the fight dragging on and being brutal would make the hype and the relief hit a lot harder when they finally unleash their ultimates and overcome the danger. Similarly, the old man Yasuo sequence lacks a lot of context for his scene. Why doesn't he have his sword, for example? Why did he wait until the entire village was on fire to step in? And most importantly, why is it meaningful that he steps in? If you already know Yasuo as a character, him stepping in is not a surprise. That's just what Yasuo does. But the visual language of the cinematic treats this moment, this decision to protect the fleeing villager, like it's important, like it's meaningful somehow, like this reveals something new about his character. Now, after the fact, Riot released the Old Man Yasuo skin based on the cinematic, and in the description for that skin, they provided some context. This is a possible future for Yasuo where he allows his guilt and shame to consume him, and the moment that he steps in is significant because it represents him reclaiming some of his past self that has been lost. Now, that's a cool story, it's an interesting place to take his character, but it would have been a lot cooler if any of that was actually in the cinematic. The thing that's supposed to make it meaningful that Old Man Yasuo answers the call to be a hero is that this version of him normally wouldn't. A scene where we see him ignoring the plight of the powerless or wallowing in his own guilt so that he has something to rise from would make it much more impactful and meaningful to finally see him rise. But that all has to get cut out of the cinematic because it only has 70 seconds to work with, and it leaves us with a scene whose impact and storytelling is severely weakened for everyone who isn't the kind of nerd who reads skin descriptions. This problem is created by Riot's determination to fit all of these stories into one cinematic and to make that cinematic no longer than a single that they want to promote on Spotify. But it's also created by a mismatch between the stories that they're trying to tell and the format with which they're trying to tell them. Kayle and Morgana's relationship needs more than 70 seconds of setup. Old Man Yasuo needs more than 70 seconds of context. But it can be done right, and in the cinematic, it is done right. Tryndamere's scene, its pacing and the balance between the story that it's telling and the time it has to do it, that is almost perfect. The Kindred are the most high-concept weirdness that might require a little bit extra context, but even their thematic role could be intuited by an outsider. Tryndamere is a man on the edge of life and death, struggling against ghosts that only he can see, which threaten to turn him into a raging beast. And Ashe is the light of his world, driving back the darkness and bringing him back to life. It's succinct, it's clean, and it's a perfect fit for the format in all the ways that the stories of Kayle and Morgana and Old Man Yasuo just simply aren't. All of this leaves me with 2 questions. Number 1, why choose this, air quotes, realistic style when it's not the optimal choice for the stories you're telling or the censorship rules that you're telling them under? And 2, why insist on cramming so many champions and so many storylines into the cinematic when the stories that you're trying to tell clearly need more room to breathe? Like, seriously, expand that Old Man Yasuo section into its own full 4-minute cinematic and it could be a masterpiece. My thesis is this. The realistic style was chosen not because it was the best choice, but because it looks expensive. Riot showed contempt for its own community, and now it wants a product that looks as expensive as possible to help make up for the bad PR and to live up to the promise of the biggest budget ever. Along the same lines, I suspect that Riot stuffed as many champions as they could into the cinematic, not because that's a good storytelling choice, but because more champions is more crowd-pleasing, and the more champions you put in there, the more expensive and epic the cinematic feels. And look, obviously the main function of a seasonal cinematic is to be a big crowd-pleasing hype generator. They're not making Ghibli movies, they're making highlight reels. The point is to generate as many big emotional swells in as short a time as possible. The point is to generate reaction videos and TikTok clips and news articles. The point is to convince people to start playing normals again. And from that perspective, yes, you can absolutely say that my criticisms here are kind of redundant. I watched the cinematic, I got excited about it, clearly it fucking worked. And yeah, sure, fair enough, but I also don't really care if the PR strategy is successful. I care about animation, I care about storytelling, and God help my wretched soul, I care about these stupid, silly League of Legends video game characters. I care that their stories are told well. And for all the high quality of craft on display in this cinematic, I think most of the scenes are actually really lacking in that regard. The aesthetic choices and the brutal compression of time here both keep detracting from stories that could be told so much better if Riot hadn't insisted on shoving them into a format that simply isn't suited for them. The last time Kayle appeared in an officially published story was 4 years ago when she was updated. That's also the last time Tryndamere had a story to his name, and there are champions in the game right now who have not had a single story told about them for almost 10 full fucking years, a decade. Riot as a company chronically neglect their characters, I guess because lore doesn't sell skins. And so a cinematic like this to me is not a cherry on top of an otherwise delicious cake. It is crumbs. Riot has been starving us forever, and I want a bigger fucking meal. But their current plans, I guess, is to massively reboot their entire lore universe again, even though they haven't finished cleaning up after the last one, so I guess I need to get back to writing that script about why making Arcane canon is a really bad idea. Okay, this video is too long already, so let's do a short outro. First, the emoji game. If you've watched the video this far, put a TV emoji in your comment and I will leave a heart on it. Plus, I'm more likely to actually read your comment because I'll know you've actually watched the whole video. Second, if you enjoy my work, you can support it on Patreon with a monthly donation or on Ko-fi with a one-time tip. A single dollar donation can be the same as like 1,000 monetized views on a video. So if you have a creator whose work you enjoy, whether that's me or someone else, consider donating to them directly if you're able. Having said that, I don't want any money that you need for yourself. Outside of that, thank you very much for your time and your attention. Remember to be kind to one another, have solidarity with those who are worse off than yourself, and may the tides of history wash gently over us all.